In August 1914, the War Office placed an emergency contract for 20,000 revolvers. The ink was not dry before the first crates left Birmingham. Each revolver bore a single name. That name was Webley. By November 1918, the Webley Street Works had shipped approximately 300,000 of them. They had been drawn from leather holsters in Flanders mud, in Mesopotamian dust, in the cockpits of Royal Flying Corps, at 8,000 feet over the Western Front. Not one of those revolvers had failed proof. Not one had left the works without the Birmingham proof mark stamped into the barrel flat, the legal guarantee that a specific charge, exceeding safe working pressure by a defined margin, had been fired through that barrel before it was fitted to a frame. In 1954, the British Army adopted a Belgian pistol, the Browning High Power, designed in Liège, manufactured by Fabrique Nationale, chambered in 9mm parabellum, became the standard British service sidearm. The Webley Revolver was not replaced. It was simply no longer ordered. By 1979, the name that had armed 900,000 British officers, colonial policemen, naval ratings, and airmen across 2 world wars was the property of a diversified industrial holding company whose core business was display and storage systems. But the real story of Webley is not the moment it was discarded. It is the story of 2 brothers in a garret workshop on Webley Street, Birmingham in 1838, and of what they built over the course of a century from the accumulated knowledge of a city that understood steel better than any other city on earth. Philip Webley was born in Birmingham in 1812, the son of a locksmith working in the gun quarter, the dense web of streets north of the city centre, bounded by St. Mary's Row, Webley Street and Lench Street, where the British commercial arms trade had concentrated itself since the 1690s. Birmingham in 1812 was not a city in the modern sense. It was a manufacturing organism. 100,000 people organized around the production of metal goods in workshops so small that a single craftsman could reach every corner from a standing position. The gun quarter was the most specialized district in that organism. Its trade was not the integrated manufacture of complete firearms. It was the subcontract trade, a system so precisely evolved over 2 centuries that a Birmingham gun assembled under one firm's name might carry the work of 12 separate craftsmen, each operating from a different garret, each responsible for one specific operation. The barrel maker drew, welded, and rough-bored the barrel blank. The barrel borer finished the internal dimensions to tolerance. The lock maker, the craftsman whose position sat highest in the trade hierarchy, filed and fitted the mechanism, the mainspring, the tumbler, the sear, the bridle, the cock. The stocker shaped and fitted the wooden furniture. The furniture maker, the trade-specific vocabulary, not the woodworker, fabricated the small metalwork. The trigger guard, the escutcheon, the butt cap. The finisher assembled all components and resolved the tolerances between them. The engraver decorated. The viewer, the trade's internal quality inspector, passed or rejected. Each workshop, each skill, each address. Separate. Philip Webley was a lock filer. That was his craft and his inheritance. Lock filing was the most demanding manual trade in the gun quarter. The fitting and adjustment of a spring-driven percussion mechanism to tolerances measured not by instruments, but by the accumulated tactile knowledge of a craftsman's hands. A poorly fitted mainspring broke under sustained firing. A poorly cut sear notch produced a trigger that released prematurely, or would not release at all. The consequences of either failure were not commercial. They were personal. He established his first workshop at 25 Webley Street at some point in the mid-1830s. The exact date unrecorded, with capital that by one account amounted to no more than £30, borrowed against his tools and his reputation. His brother, Thomas William Webley, born 7 years later in 1819, joined the business before 1840, bringing with him the commercial instinct that Philip, by all available evidence, neither possessed nor particularly sought. The firm traded initially as P. Webley and Son. The son was a commercial convention rather than a precise genealogical statement. Philip had no son of working age at the time of founding. What the name communicated to the trade was continuity, a family commitment to the craft, to the address, and to the quality of the work that left it. The market gap they identified was not subtle. British military revolver procurement in the 1840s was fragmented among a dozen Birmingham makers, none of whom held a comprehensive War Office contract, and all of whom produced to slightly different specifications and tolerances. The Board of Ordnance, the procurement body responsible for all British military weapons acquisition before its abolition in 1855, had no standardized revolver in service. Officers purchased their own sidearms from the trade, carried whatever pattern they preferred, and submitted to no binding specification beyond the proof requirement at the Birmingham Proof House on Banbury Street. Proof, the process by which every commercially produced barrel in Britain was submitted to the Proof House and subjected to a deliberately overcharged firing, exceeding maximum working pressure by a margin defined by statute, was not optional. The Birmingham Proof House, established by Act of Parliament in 1813, stamped every barrel that passed with the Birmingham proof mark, a crown over crossed scepters and the letters BPC. A barrel that failed proof was destroyed. A barrel that passed bore a legal guarantee of structural integrity at service pressure. The stamp was the only quality claim that meant anything in the British trade. Philip Webley understood proof. He had been filing lock components against proof-passed barrels his entire working life. His observation, the one that would define everything that followed, was not technical genius. It was craftsman's logic. If the service revolver market was fragmented by competing specifications, the firm that submitted a consistent, mechanically superior design to a consolidated War Office requirement would own that market completely. The requirement was coming. Both brothers could see it forming. The revolver that the British Army eventually standardized was not the first Webley. It was the product of 3 decades of iterative development. A line of percussion and cartridge revolvers produced across the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s that established the firm's mechanical vocabulary before the decisive design arrived. Philip Webley's percussion revolvers of the 1850s were competent trade pieces, 6-shot, double-action capable, submitted to the Birmingham Proof House on Banbury Street before leaving the works, sold to the civilian trade and to individual officers at prices ranging from £3 to £5 per revolver, depending on finish and barrel length. £3 to £5 in 1855 was approximately 3 weeks' wages for a skilled Birmingham craftsman. For a British infantry officer drawing junior pay, it represented a month's expenditure on a single sidearm. The revolvers sold. The conversion to metallic cartridge came in the 1860s. This was not a Webley invention. The center-fire metallic cartridge case was a development of continental and American origin, but Webley's adaptation of their revolver action to accommodate it was mechanically superior to most of what the British trade offered at the time. The key was the top break action. A top break action, the mechanism that would define the Webley service revolver for 60 years, is a hinge mounted at the standing breech that allows the barrel and cylinder assembly to pivot downward at an angle of approximately 40 degrees when a release catch is operated. As the barrel pivots, a star-shaped extractor plate rises automatically through the cylinder, simultaneously pushing all 6 spent cartridge cases clear of the chambers. A trained shooter could eject, reload, and close the action in under 10 seconds. Under the wire-cutting fire of a German counterattack, that difference between 10 seconds and 30 seconds, the time required to extract and reload a fixed-cylinder revolver case by case, was the difference the firm's sales catalog did not need to explain. Officers understood it themselves. The Webley Prize revolver of 1876 introduced this mechanism to the British commercial market. The price? Approximately £4 10 shillings in 1876, or roughly 2.5 weeks' wages for a skilled Birmingham operative, undercut the Tranter and Adams competition by 18 pence to 2 shillings per unit. The Indian Army Ordnance Corps noted it immediately. The critical submission came in 1887. The War Office, seeking to standardize service revolver procurement following the irregular procurement pattern of the preceding 30 years, issued a specification and invited makers to submit designs for trial at the Royal Arsenal, Woolwich, the proving ground and ordnance testing facility that had governed every British military adoption decision since 1695. Webley submitted the design that would become the Webley Mk I, a .4 .05 Webley caliber, 6-shot, top-break, double-action revolver with a 4-inch barrel, a stirrup pattern barrel latch, and a construction intended from the first to be maintained and repaired by a soldier under field conditions without specialist tools. The .455 Webley cartridge, a rimmed center fire round, 455 thousandths of an inch in bore diameter, firing a 265 grain lead bullet at approximately 600 feet per second, was not designed for sport. It was designed to stop a man reliably, at close quarters, under conditions that the Woolwich trials could not fully simulate, and the northwest frontier, the Transvaal, and the river valleys of the Sudan eventually would. The Woolwich trial results of 1887 recommended adoption. The War Office accepted the recommendation. The Webley Mk I became the official standard sidearm of the British Army, the Royal Navy, and the Royal Irish Constabulary in the same year. The royal warrant of appointment followed, by appointment to Her Majesty Queen Victoria. The warrant was not a decoration, and it was not a contract. It was a public declaration, made in the sovereign's name, that the holder supplied the royal household. Its commercial value in an era when royal association was the most powerful endorsement available to a British manufacturer was considerable. But the War Office contract was the moat. The warrant was the flag planted on top of it. The price to the War Office in 1887 was £3 12 shillings per revolver, approximately a week's wages for a skilled Birmingham lock filer. Tranter had been charging £3 14 shillings for a functionally inferior design in the same caliber family. The differential was not large. The exclusivity was absolute. Between 1887 and 1914, Webley and Scott, the name adopted in 1906 following the integration of the Scott shotgun business through Philip Webley's son-in-law, William Middleditch Scott, produced 6 successive marks of the service revolver, each addressing specific deficiencies identified in service conditions across the British Empire. The Mk II, adopted in 1894, lengthened the barrel and revised the cylinder stop geometry to improve timing under rapid fire. The Mk III, 1897, reinforced the standing breech to address frame wear identified in the Indian Army. The Mk IV, 1899, revised the barrel latch and introduced a modified ejector plate following experience gained in the First Boer War. The Mk V, 1913, strengthened the cylinder flute geometry. The Mk VI, 1915, became the definitive variant, a 6-shot .455 Webley caliber, top-break revolver with a 6-inch barrel, a bird's head grip, and a trigger mechanism adjusted for consistent double-action pull across a wider manufacturing tolerance range to sustain wartime production rates. Each mark, each year, each specific engineering problem solved. The customer list by 1910 was the map of the British Empire, named institution by institution. The War Office supplied revolvers to British expeditionary forces from Afghanistan to West Africa. The Indian Army Ordnance Corps standardized the Mk IV across its officer corps. In 1899, the largest single export contract the Weman Street Works had yet received. The Royal Irish Constabulary carried Webleys from 1887. The Cape Mounted Rifles, the Natal Police, the Australian Colonial Defence Forces, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Each institution drew from stocks bearing the Webley name and the Birmingham proof mark. Export agents in Calcutta, Cape Town, and Ottawa held standing orders that ran year on year without revision. The civilian market sustained the gap between War Office contracts. The commercial Webley WG model, a target-grade variant of the service revolver, offered to the civilian market at £5 5 shillings in 1893, sold across the Army and Navy Stores catalogue, through gun dealers on the Strand, through the Birmingham trade to sportsmen and travellers who considered a heavy revolver reasonable personal insurance on the routes the Empire had opened and then failed to fully police. Then came August 1914. The mobilization order reached the Weymouth Street Works within 48 hours of the declaration of war. The War Office had anticipated a revolver requirement. It had not anticipated the scale of what 4 years of industrial warfare would demand. The Webley Mk VI was the variant produced throughout the Great War. The works on Weymouth Street shifted to a production rate that the peacetime workshops had not been designed to sustain. Women trained on capstan lathes and on the barrel boring machines that had previously been operated exclusively by time-served male craftsmen. Pensioned barrel borers returned to the bench. Boys fresh from apprenticeship were placed on cylinder fluting operations that men with 15 years' experience had previously supervised. By November 1917, the Weymouth Street Works was producing approximately 2,400 Webley Mk VI revolvers per week, an output sustained across 52 weeks of that year against a War Office delivery schedule that allowed no revision downward. Every barrel submitted to the Birmingham Proof House on Banbury Street before leaving the works. Every proof mark stamped. Every cylinder timed to specification. The stakes were not abstract. If a Webley Mk VI's cylinder locking bolt failed under the wet clay conditions at Passchendaele, where water infiltrated the action through the barrel cylinder gap in standing positions, an infantry officer conducting a trench raid with a 6-man section had a revolver that would not rotate and a mechanism so fouled that clearing it under fire was not possible. The bolt geometry was the engineering decision that determined whether that officer had a functional weapon or a handled metal weight. The Weymouth Street bench fitters knew this. The cylinder fitters who hand-timed each example knew it. The Royal Flying Corps issued the Mk VI to all aircrew from 1916. If a pilot downed behind German lines required it, the revolver was the tool available. The Royal Navy issued it to officers of the Grand Fleet. The Third Army, Fifth Army, and Anzac Corps on the Western Front all drew from stocks bearing the Weymouth Street address and the Birmingham proof mark. By 1918, the Webley Mk VI was the most widely issued British sidearm in history, carried by officers of more regiments, in more theatres, on more fronts than any revolver before or since produced in the British Isles. The Ministry of Munitions issued a formal commendation to the works in 1917, acknowledging consistent delivery against schedule. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a medal pinned to a bench vise. The workers who received it were already planning for the next shift. The interwar years produced 2 significant developments. First, the Webley Mk IV in .38/200 caliber, a smaller, lighter, more modern revolver adopted by the War Office in 1932 as the new standard British service sidearm, chambered in .38 Smith & Wesson caliber, designated .380/200 in British service, firing a 200-grain bullet. Intended to replace the heavy .455 caliber across infantry and supporting arms. The .38/200 Mk IV was a genuine engineering refinement. Smaller, faster into the hand, adequate for the close quarters role the pistol actually served in modern warfare, and manufacturable at a rate and cost the .455 series could not match. Second, a curiosity that had never achieved series production but had never entirely left the Webley catalogue. The Webley Fosbury automatic revolver, patented in 1895 by Colonel George Vincent Fosbury and manufactured by Webley from 1901 to 1939 in very limited numbers. The Webley Fosbury was a recoil-operated revolver, a mechanism that used the energy of each fired cartridge to rotate the cylinder and cock the action for the next shot, reducing the trigger pull required to fire to a single action press. It was the only self-cocking revolver ever produced in series in Britain. It sold to target shooters and to a small number of officers who valued the light trigger above all else. It was not a service weapon. It was a refinement of an idea that the self-loading pistol would eventually render unnecessary. But in 1910, when the self-loading pistol in Britain was still a novelty, it represented a genuine engineering position. Philip Webley had died in 1888, the year after the Mark I was adopted. He did not live to see the royal warrant renewed under Edward VII, or the Weymouth Street Works at full wartime production, or the commendation from the Ministry of Munitions. Thomas William Webley outlived him by 9 years. William Middleditch Scott, the architect of the 1906 merger, guided the combined Webley and Scott business through the Edwardian peak and the Great War production years. The name above the door of the Weymouth Street Works had changed once. The engineering philosophy had not. The trajectory changed in 1954, not with a bankruptcy, not with a fire, with a War Office decision announced in a procurement circular. The British Army would adopt the Browning High Power as its standard service pistol. The High Power, a 9mm parabellum semi-automatic pistol, designed by John Moses Browning and perfected by Dieudonné Saïve at Fabrique Nationale's works in Liège, Belgium, offered 13 rounds in a detachable box magazine against the Webley 6 in a fixed cylinder. It was lighter. It was faster to reload. It had been the standard pistol of the German, Belgian, Canadian, and nationalist Chinese armies in various forms since the late 1930s. Its adoption by the British Army was not a surprise to anyone who had read the post-war trials reports. It was, nonetheless, final. The Firearms Act. 1920 had already removed the first layer of commercial protection. Passed in the aftermath of the Easter Rising and the social anxieties of the post-war years, the Act introduced the Firearms Certificate System, requiring civilian purchasers to obtain a certificate from their county constabulary before acquiring any pistol or revolver. The Act did not prohibit civilian ownership. It raised the administrative threshold for it. In a market where the Army and Navy Store's catalog had once offered the commercial Webley WG target revolver to anyone with £5, 5 shillings and a desire to own it, the certificate requirement was the first narrowing of the channel. The Firearms Act. 1968 consolidated and tightened the 1920 framework. The Firearms Amendment Act 1988, passed following the Hungerford shooting of August 1987, banned semi-automatic centerfire rifles and certain pump-action shotguns outright. Each act reduced a different segment of what had been a diversified commercial base. None of them alone was sufficient to close a firm the size of Webley and Scott. Together, cumulative, they eliminated the civilian market for centerfire pistols and revolvers by degrees. Not in a single legislative act, but in a process of successive narrowings that spanned 70 years. The 1979 acquisition by Harris and Sheldon Group was the third blow. Harris and Sheldon was a Birmingham-based, diversified industrial holding company whose principal interests were display systems, retail fittings, and precision engineering for applications far removed from firearms manufacture. Its acquisition of Webley and Scott preserved the name and the remaining production assets. It did not preserve the manufacturing culture. The senior craftsmen who had timed cylinders and fitted actions at Weymouth Street were approaching or past retirement age by 1979. The apprenticeship pipeline that might have replaced them had been running at reduced intake since the late 1950s. The craft knowledge problem in British firearms manufacture is not metaphorical. The hand-fitting of a revolver cylinder, the process by which the cylinder's rotation is adjusted to bring each chamber into precise alignment with the barrel bore at the moment of firing, is a skill transmitted through demonstration, correction, and accumulated hand sensation. It is not captured in a technical drawing. The Birmingham Proof House could tell you whether a finished revolver passed proof. It could not restore the knowledge of how to build one to a tolerance that passed proof consistently, at production rates, in the hands of craftsmen who had never been taught. The Firearms Amendment Act 1997, passed in the aftermath of the Dunblane Primary School shooting of March 1996, prohibited the ownership of virtually all handguns in mainland Britain. Section 1 of the Act banned centerfire pistols and revolvers above .22 caliber outright. Section 2 extended the ban to .22 rimfire pistols within 12 months. The commercial consequences for what remained of the British pistol trade were complete and immediate. A market that had been narrowing since 1920 closed entirely. By 1997, Webley and Scott was producing air pistols, air rifles, and shotguns. The centerfire revolver, the product that had sustained the Weymouth Street Works through 2 world wars and had armed the British officer corps for 60 years, had not been in production for the better part of a decade. The last Webley Mk VI to leave official British Army service was logged in 1979. The Weymouth Street Works did not survive the decade that followed. The capstan lathes that had produced 2,400 revolvers per week in 1917 went cold. The barrel borers retired. The cylinder fitters did not train successors. The Birmingham proof house on Banbury Street remained open. There were no more Webley barrels to submit to it. The name survived, on paper, under different ownership, in Exeter. The name Webley and Scott Limited exists today, trading from Exeter, Devon, a distance of 160 miles from the Weymouth Street address where Philip Webley filed his first lock spring in the 1830s. The current business produces air pistols, air rifles, and shotguns. Competent, commercially viable products with no direct manufacturing connection to the centerfire revolver line. The Birmingham proof house on Banbury Street still submits shotgun barrels from the current Webley product range to proof. The proof mark is the same. The address it guarantees is not. The secondary market for original Webley service revolvers has been active and consistent for 40 years. Holt's Auctioneers, the specialist firearms auction house, lists Webley Mk IV and Mk VI examples in deactivated configuration at prices ranging from £850 to £2,400, depending on variant, condition, proof status, and the legibility of the War Office Broad Arrow Acceptance Mark stamped into the frame. Bonham's handles the more significant examples, presentation pieces, officers' cased sets, and the rare Webley Fosbury automatic revolver, which in original, unmodified condition with documentation has achieved £3,500 to £6,000 at auction in recent years. Rock Island Auction Company in the United States handles Webley export variants and commercial examples for the North American collector market. The collector societies that document this history are specific and serious. The Arms and Armor Society, founded in 1950, holds the most comprehensive reference library of British military and commercial arms documentation in private hands. The Historical Breech-Loading Small Arms Association, the HBSA, maintains shooting classifications for original British service arms under which deactivated examples can be studied and handled. And live original examples can be fired at HBSA events under license conditions that the Firearms Amendment Acts created but did not entirely eliminate. The Royal Armouries at Leeds holds the definitive institutional collection of Webley service variants, including the Mk I through Mk VI in representative condition, displayed within the Arms and Armour Gallery alongside the documentary record of their adoption, service, and retirement. The reason the original Webley Mk VI commands that premium in the collector market, beyond its historical significance, is concrete and functional. A Webley Mk VI, hand-timed on the Weymouth Street bench between 1915 and 1918, carries a cylinder timing geometry adjusted by a craftsman against the specific barrel it was fitted to. The tolerances between cylinder and barrel in an original Webley, in serviceable condition, are not the product of a machine specification. They are the product of a craftsman's eye and hand, working against a standard that the craftsman understood in his body, before he understood it in words. No production revolver manufactured to CNC specification since 1970 has replicated that relationship precisely. Target shooters who compete under HBSA classification know this. They do not always state it publicly. The physical site of the original Webley and Scott works, Weeman Street, Birmingham Gun Quarter, was redeveloped through the 1980s and 1990s. What stands at the address today is a mixed commercial and light industrial development. A section of Weeman Street itself was substantially altered in the Birmingham Inner Ring roadworks of the 1960s. There is no interpretive panel. There is no scheduled monument. The proof mark on the surviving revolvers is the only commemorative marker that was never designed to commemorate anything. The surprise that the trade catalogues never recorded? Philip Webley, the lock filer who had borrowed £30 against his tools and his reputation to begin work on Weeman Street, was also a significant private benefactor to the working-class educational infrastructure of Birmingham's Gun Quarter. By the late 1870s, when the War Office contract had stabilized the firm's finances, he contributed to the funding of the Weeman Street Mechanics Reading Room, a lending library and evening study facility for the craftsmen and apprentices of the gun quarter trade. The contribution was never publicly attributed to him in any surviving newspaper record. The reading room itself was gone by 1900, absorbed into the expanding Webley works. The knowledge it was built to transmit outlasted the building by 40 years. The knowledge the building embodied outlasted both. What the story of Webley represents in the longer arc of British industrial history is not a failure of individual will or commercial judgment. It is the account of what happens when a precision manufacturing culture built over a century and a half, transmitted through apprenticeship and hand labor, held in the collective memory of a specific street in a specific city, encounters a sequence of forces that no individual firm, however well managed, could absorb or redirect. Legislative restriction, military procurement realignment, conglomerate acquisition, the progressive retirement of the craftsmen who held the knowledge. These forces did not arrive simultaneously. They arrived across 70 years, each one narrowing the viable space within which a British revolver manufacturer could operate, until the space was too small to sustain what it had once contained. Birmingham made the Webley Revolver. The Birmingham Proof House guaranteed it. The War Office issued it. The Empire carried it. The legislation prohibited it. The acquisition renamed it. The craftsmen retired and were not replaced. And somewhere in the Royal Armouries at Leeds, behind the archival glass, a Webley Mk VI assembled at Weeman Street in the autumn of 1917, sits in exactly the condition its cylinder fitter left it. Action cycling cleanly, barrel to cylinder gap within specification, the Birmingham proof mark still sharp on the barrel flat, and the Weeman Street address still legible on the frame, doing precisely what a craftsman's hands put into it 107 years ago. See you in the next one.